days to Election Day. No mysteries about how the Republican presidential nominee will govern if he returns to the White House. Day after day, Donald Trump has been escalating the rhetoric, repeatedly threatening to jail his opponents, referring to them as criminals, openly musing about silencing any dissent. On Sunday, Trump told Fox News that the military should be deployed against the, quote, enemy within on Election Day.
Are you expecting chaos on Election Day?
No, I don't think so. Not from the side that votes for Trump.
But I'm just wondering if these outside agitators will start up on Election Day.
I think the bigger problem is the enemy from within, not even the people that have come in and destroying our country. By the way, totally destroying our country. The towns, the villages, they're being inundated. But I don't think they're the problem in terms of Election Day. I think the bigger problem are the people from within. We have some very bad people. We have some sick people, radical left lunatics. And I think they're and it should be very easily handled by, if necessary, by National Guard, or if really necessary, by the military, because they can't let that happen.
It almost goes without saying at this point, but 4 years ago, it was not the left that sowed chaos in the election. It wasn't the Biden campaign that tried to start a riot at the ballot counting center or spread lies that the election was stolen or whipped up a mob to storm the Capitol, with the National Guard having to come in to quell the violence. But now, in the friendly confines of Fox News, the same outlet, I will remind you, that had to pay $750 million for spreading baseless election fraud lies, comes another claim put before the eyes of millions of his supporters, many of whom still doubt the integrity of the 2020 election, and weeks before people are done voting. Trump is saying that there could be chaos in this election. Well, Donald Trump is not the president, has no power to call in the National Guard in November. His comments, they are part of a pattern, the latest in a long series of unprecedented, norm-busting statements that happen all too often to ignore. Susan Glasser from The New Yorker put it, quote, the enemy within, straight-up language of dictators and tyrants who want to use the military on their own people. And if it couldn't be any clearer that he was referring to his critics and political opponents as the enemy from within, here's Trump from that same interview just a few minutes later.
And the enemy from within, in my opinion, is more dangerous than China, Russia, and all these countries, because if you have a smart president, he can handle them pretty easily. I got along great with all, I handled them. But the thing that's tougher to handle are these lunatics that we have inside, like Adam Schiff.
It is the kind of rhetoric that led one person to describe Trump as, quote, fascist to the core. That person, not a scholar or a democracy activist or a political opponent. It is someone who served under Trump. Former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley. In an upcoming book by journalist Bob Woodward, Milley says, quote, no one has ever been as dangerous to this country as Donald Trump. Now, I realize he's a total fascist. He's the most dangerous person to this country. Here's what former Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney had to say about that on Meet the Press.
Like Mark Milley comes to mind, who, according to Bob Woodward's new book, War, called him a fascist. Would you go that far as to call him a fascist?
Look, I have tremendous respect for General Milley, and I see no reason to disagree with that assessment.
And that is where we start today with retired U.S. Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel Amy McGrath. She is the founder of the Democratic Majority Action PAC. Also, MSNBC columnist and contributor Charlie Sykes is here. And with me at the table, MSNBC Justice and Legal Affairs analyst and former senior advisor to A.G. Garland, Anthony Coley. Thank you all so much for being with us. Amy, let's start with you on Milley's comments. A military man? He is used to making sober, rational, calculated decisions. When he says things like Donald Trump is the most dangerous person to this country, that sounds to me like a threat assessment.
Absolutely. And it's also unprecedented. I mean, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, this is the #1 ranking military officer in our nation, somebody who was very close to Trump, who was his handpicked advisor. To say that, it just shows you how we're living in extraordinary times. And I think, normally with Trump's rhetoric, we see it a lot, and we sort of become numb to it, in our country. This type of rhetoric is very, very dangerous, and it goes against almost 250 years of tradition and trust that we have in our military. Look, in the United States of America, we do not use our military against our own people. And for Donald Trump or any candidate for president to even suggest that is a very scary, dark place that he wants to take our country. And that's why General Milley is saying he's the most dangerous person that he knows to our country right now.
Amy, if Milley really thinks that Donald Trump is a dangerous fascist, a threat to this country, does he have an obligation to speak out, to say that more publicly in more public platforms?
You know what? I think he has. Would I like him to be even more public? Yes. You know who I would like to be even more public than General Milley, because General Milley wore the uniform and there's a deep tradition of being nonpartisan. I would like those political appointees who happen to be former generals who were in Trump's administration, like Secretary of Defense Mattis, his Chief of Staff, John Kelly. Those men need to come forward and tell us what they saw and heard. And also, we should note that his former Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, has said that Donald Trump tried to use the military against peaceful protesters, saying, hey, why can't you just shoot them? And that's one of the reasons why he is saying Trump is unfit for office. So a lot of them have come forward already.
So, Charlie, for those who have not come forward as publicly as some of us might have liked, you have the vice president invoking Milley in her remarks at Greenville, North Carolina. Take a listen.
Anybody who wants to be president of the United States, who has called for the, quote, termination of the Constitution of the United States, should never again have the ability to stand behind the seal of the President of the United States. Never again. Never again. And the people who know him best know it. His former national security advisor, 2 of his former defense secretaries, his former chief of staff in the White House, his own vice president, have all warned America Donald Trump is unfit to serve. Just listen most recently to what we heard General Milley said. General Milley, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs under Donald Trump. It was just reported, he said, quote, no one has ever been as dangerous to this country, in referring to Donald Trump. Think about that. Think about that.
You got to admit, Charlie, that no matter how many times you tick through that list of folks who have come out and spoken out against him, tried to warn America, even when there are new additions to that list, it is equally alarming every time, equally stunning.
It is, and it's a hell of a closing argument for the vice president to make. The people closest to Donald Trump have said that he's unfit for office, and absolutely they need to speak out right now. If in fact this is a threat to the country, if in fact this is an emergency, I think this is what patriots do. They put country over party. You know, and to your earlier point, look, this is the reddest of red lines, using the military against other Americans, but it is an obsession of Donald Trump. He has said it over and over again. He's mused about using the Insurrection Act. He's talked about firing generals and putting MAGA-friendly officers in their place. And Liz Cheney has been concerned about this from the beginning. You might recall that in the days leading up to January 6th, she and her father were instrumental in getting every single living former Secretary of Defense to sign an open letter saying that the military had no role to play in American elections. That was an amazing moment, but it was also an indication of how alarmed they had to be that they thought that they had to write that letter. So this is not something that is just a one-off or a gaffe by Donald Trump. This is something that he has thought about, talked about over and over again. As you said, there's a real pattern here.
Right, I agree with what Charlie is saying. This was clearly something that he thought about. Just the fact that he ticks through all of the other places, people, things he is positioned as threats. Right. China, Russia, migrants, which we know is a sort of favorite go-to threat, and then says, forget all of those. The greatest threat that actually faces this country is the, quote, enemy from in. There's the moment he says that. There's then what happens after.
Right. So about these Milley remarks, it was so important, Alicia, that the vice president doubled down and reiterated these remarks yesterday in Eastern North Carolina. Now I'm from Eastern North Carolina. For folks who may not be familiar with that part of the country, extremely conservative, very strong military presence. So when somebody like General Milley, when he says things like this, I mean, it's resonant with all of us as Americans, but is particularly resonant with people who put country over party. I'm talking Nikki Haley voters. Now, the other thing that struck me, and you opened here with this report, Donald Trump talking about the radical left. What struck me the most about this entire situation is what happened afterwards, Alicia. The Washington Post reached out to the Trump campaign and asked for clarification. But the Trump campaign, they didn't clarify, they doubled down. They equated efforts from the left, Alicia, to what we saw, to the arrest of an Afghan terrorist last week in Oklahoma. Do you remember this story? This was a man who had served as a security guard for the CIA in Afghanistan. He came to the United States on a humanitarian parole. The FBI is investigating whether or not, when he was radicalized, he was arrested just days ago for purchasing 2 AK-47s, among other weapons. And this is the person that the Trump campaign is likening to Trump's political enemies.
Well, it gets to the point, Charlie, this is clearly something that they have calculated. This is not an accident. Right. It is not a gaffe. Is that just about the chaos, or is it about something else?
You know, it's very interesting when you think about the rhetoric of the last week or so that Donald Trump has calculated. He believes that all of the racism, the lies, the fascist adjacent rhetoric, if it's not even adjacent, that this works for him. That by turning Americans against one another, by making us fear other Americans more than any other threat, that somehow this is going to redound to his benefit. And so this is, again, I think, one of the overriding questions in this election. Is he right? Is he seeing is he picking up in the polls when he lies about Haitian immigrants, when he lies about the immigrants in Aurora, when he talks about using the military against fellow Americans? Is there a large enough segment of the electorate, at least of his base, that is aroused by that, that in fact it will help him? Because he clearly believes that it's working for him right now.
I want you, Amy, to listen to 2 pieces of sound. The first is Liz Cheney, something she said yesterday on Meet the Press. And then I want you to listen, and then I will read to you some of what Donald Trump has said about how he wants to use the military. Let's play that sound, and then we'll talk on the other side.
You know, I think people really need to look very carefully at what Donald Trump will do if he were ever to be in the Oval Office again. The extent to which that, and he has said repeatedly that, he believes he will be immune. Certainly the Supreme Court ruling, whatever they thought they were. He will not respect the rulings of our courts. And people have to realize our courts can't enforce their own rulings. So if a president refuses to carry out his obligation to do so, then we are no longer a nation of laws. Donald Trump will ignore Congress. He will appoint people like Mike Flynn, for example, who just 36 hours ago, Mike Flynn was at an event where he was asked whether or not the president's opponents should be executed. And he basically said, listen, yes, I'm going to unleash the gates of hell. These are the kinds of people that Donald Trump will be putting in place. The people that stopped him from his worst desires last time around won't serve again.
So, Amy, I want you to take that and put it side by side with this reporting from the AP about Donald Trump's plans for the military if he were to be reelected. Quote, he has pledged to recall thousands of American troops from overseas and station them at the U.S. border with Mexico. He has explored using troops for domestic policy priorities such as deportations and confronting civil unrest. He has talked of weeding out military officers who are ideologically opposed to him. When you take those 2 pieces, what we just heard from former Congresswoman Cheney, that reporting from the AP, you put them side by side. What does that tell you about a second Trump term?
Well, I think it's important to know, first of all, I agree with Liz Cheney 100%. We did a number of national security experts, leaders, including many former admirals and generals in the spring and the summer did what are called war games, democracy exercises, what have you, looking at Trump's rhetoric, looking at his plans and playing through scenarios and trying to figure out, could he actually do some of these things? And what we found was very sobering in that he could. The president has broad powers when it comes to domestic use of the military. And unfortunately, a lot of that is because in our country, the laws surrounding that are mostly procedural. We have traditions in this country, and he doesn't care about traditions. But it would be so dangerous because it would rip the fabric of our military in half when you're talking about using the United States military against our own people. That is something that we in America do not do. And so that's why this is so dangerous. And we got to keep talking about it. And we got to keep shining the light on this rhetoric, because it is what he tried to do in the last term, as you mentioned before. There's no reason to believe that he won't do it or won't try to do it again. And the guardrails will be off this time.
Anthony, I want you to take a listen to what Tim Walz had to say about this idea of the enemy from within.
He crossed a line that I have to tell you, in my lifetime, I would have never imagined, because we know our history. Donald Trump over the weekend was talking about using the U.S. Army against people who disagree with him. Just so you're clear about that, that's you. That's what he's talking about. This is not some mythical thing out there. He called it the enemy within. And to Donald Trump, anybody who doesn't agree with him is the enemy. I tell you that not to make you fearful or anything. I tell you that because we need to whip his butt and put this guy behind us.
Given that he says so many inflammatory, absurd things, I think turning to the American people and saying, he's talking about you. When he's talking about the enemy from within, that's not an esoteric concept. It's you, the voter.
That's exactly right. And I'm glad to hear Tim Walz out here saying that, number one, he is absolutely the right type of a messenger. You know who I think is the most effective messenger, though? Same message, different messenger. The Liz Cheneys, the General Milley's of the world. I'm thinking the 40 of the 44 cabinet secretaries who are saying that Donald Trump is not fit to be president, right? We need to hear more from them. It's not enough for them to say they are just not going to vote for Donald Trump. They need to take a page from longtime conservatives like our friend Charlie Sykes, who just last week endorsed Kamala Harris for president. We need more people who put country over party. That's the only way we are going to finally break this fever of Trumpism in our country.
We're going to get to that endorsement a little later in the show. Amy McGrath, thank you so much for starting us off. Charlie, Anthony, you're sticking with me. When we come back, Vice President Harris expanding her media appearances in these final few weeks, sitting down in some pretty friendly Trump territory. With the race looking like it's in a dead heat, she has agreed on an interview with Fox News. Plus, another unfulfilled promise. This time, it's not his tax returns, but it's Donald Trump's medical records. Kamala Harris calling him out on that. We're going to play that for you. And later in the show, his conspiracies and lies about the 2020 election still getting a lot of play in the year 2024, thanks to those like J.D. Vance and Mike Johnson. 3 weeks locked in an office, poring over every morsel of polling data down to the last decimal point, and it would not change the reality. The latest figures from NBC News 3 weeks out, Harris 48, Trump 48. So the name of the game now, turnout, scraping for every last vote. For both candidates today, that means a trip to Pennsylvania, among the most critical battleground states. And if the vice president's appearance there is anything like her rally in North Carolina Sunday, you can expect her to turn up the heat. Just watch.
Anybody who wants to be president of the United States, who has called for the, quote, termination of the Constitution of the United States, should never again have the ability to stand behind the seal of the President of the United States. Never again. his former chief of staff in the White House, his own vice president have all warned America Donald Trump is unfit to serve.
Sounds so powerful, I may play it a third time. Well, talk about applying pressure. This afternoon, Fox News announced anchor Bret Baier will sit down with Vice President Harris for an interview near Philadelphia on Wednesday. It's a notable development for two reasons. First, Harris will have an opportunity to speak directly to an audience, perhaps skewed toward her opponent. But that's the other thing. Trump dodged a second debate. He ducked a big 60 Minutes interview in favor of addressing his own silo. And now, Harris will get a word in edgewise. Joining our conversation, distinguished political scholar and professor at Princeton University, Eddie Cloud, Charlie and Anthony also back with us. Charlie, what do you think about Harris on Fox News?
Well, I think she's showing that she has more guts than Donald Trump has, that she's willing to go into hostile territory. And again, this is one of those themes that, you know, Donald Trump is a weak man who tries to pretend to be a strong man, and yet he runs away from the debates. He runs away from 60 Minutes. I mean, the reality is that there's a very small number of persuadable voters out there. They're probably not watching shows like this or Fox News. And yet I think she has to do this. She has to show that she is willing to basically put the pedal to the metal, go wherever anyone wants to ask her these tough questions.
Eddie, Trump, as you will recall, sat down for an interview with Bret Baier one-on-one just last year. Take a look how that went.
President Mike Pence is running against you.
Yeah.
Your ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, she's running against you. Your former Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, said he's not supporting you. You mentioned National Security Advisor John Bolton. He's not supporting you either. You mentioned Attorney General Bill Barr, says you shouldn't be president again, calls you the consummate narcissist and troubled man. You recently called Barr a gutless pig. Your second defense secretary is not supporting you, called you irresponsible. This week, you and your White House called your White House Chief of Staff John Kelly weak and ineffective and born with a very small brain. You called your acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney a born loser. You called your first Secretary of State Rex Tillerson dumb as a rock, and your first Defense Secretary James Mattis the world's most overrated general. You called your White House Press Secretary Kayleigh Canadian milquetoast, and multiple times you've referred to your Transportation Secretary Elaine Chao as Mitch McConnell's China-loving wife. So, why did you hire all of them in the first place?
Because I hired 10 to 1 that were fantastic.
Just damning, even a year later. But then Trump, of course, called that interview unfriendly, called it nasty, because he didn't like the truth being reflected back at him.
You know, we know he's a troubled adolescent. He can't deal with anybody challenging him in any substantive way. I think this is a good thing for the vice president to do. It gives us a sense of the scope of her courage and her strength. She's willing to go into hostile territory and hold her on. But what really matters is the ground game, the blocking and tackling. Yeah. We know that she has 50 offices in Pennsylvania. We know that she has over 400 staffers on payroll. We know that they've knocked on 100,000 doors. It's the blocking and tackling. So she can go on television. It's all what they're doing on the ground.
You've been in the rooms where these decisions are made about where you deploy a principal, the message you are deploying them with. I think it is equally telling that in these rallies, she is sharpening the contrast.
Oh, yeah. This is one thing that the Harris campaign, they know how to do really well. They know how to create that contrast. That's in part what the release of these medical records were about just yesterday, right? But they also know how to put Donald Trump on the offense, and that's what she is doing.
On the offense or on the defense?
On the defense, right. That's
all I know about sports. There you go. You're welcome.
But that's what she was doing in Eastern North Carolina yesterday. Going back to North Carolina, this is important because people don't go east of I-95 unless they're going to the Outer Banks, right? But there are so many, conservative voters, but there are also a higher percentage of African-American voters. But these are people that national Democrats overlook. And so yesterday, she went to church. She met with black farmers. She was embraced by longtime Congresswoman Eva Clayton, who is legendary in Eastern North Carolina. That's the type of stuff and the type of conversations that she needs to have. That's why she's going on Fox News trying to reach these Nikki Haley voters. That's why she's talking to Charlemagne the God tomorrow. Again, these are not softball interviews. I don't know how much people know about Charlemagne, but he's a provocateur, right? And Britt Baer himself, he's not going to give her any hardballs either.
I love that you were repping Eastern North Carolina so hard today.
Somebody has to, man.
Charlie, got to make sure I talk about your endorsement, your piece this week on why I'm voting for Kamala Harris. You suggested it, quote, might feel warm and fuzzy to write in George Washington, but he's not on the ballot. Seems like a message to some of your fellow Republicans who have said they won't vote for Trump, but they're just not sure they can come out and vote for Kamala Harris.
Yeah, you have a lot of them who have the partisan muscle memory, but I think this was a point that Liz Cheney made when she endorsed Kamala Harris, which is that in this election we do not have the luxury of keeping our hands clean or being above the fight. If you really regard Donald Trump as a real danger to the country, there's only one person that can stop him from being sworn in as president on January 20th, and that's Kamala Harris. So this is a moment to set aside ideological differences. This is not right or left. This is not an election that's going to turn on how we feel about taxes on carried interest. We can have these debates later, but right now, this is the existential moment where you have to step up. This is the time for choosing, and it's either going to be Donald Trump or it's Kamala Harris. And I think that there are a lot of conservatives who need to understand that they can have the debates later, but right now, they have to do what they know is right. They have to put country ahead of party.
An election is very much a time for choosing. Charlie Sykes, thank you so much for spending some time with us. The table is sticking with me next. 78-year-old Donald Trump at around 1 in the morning calling on Kamala Harris to take a cognitive test as he keeps his own medical records to himself. We've got much more ahead. Stay with us.
Presidential camp, every other presidential candidate in modern era has done it. Why does his staff want him to hide away? One must question, are they afraid that people will see that he is too weak and unstable to lead America? Is that what's going on?
My, how the tables do turn. Donald Trump sought to make his campaign against President Biden about fitness, like health and age, but now that his opponent is 2 decades younger than him, well, times they change. Harris's 2-page medical report released Saturday shows she, quote, possesses the physical and mental resiliency required to successfully execute the duties. Meanwhile, Donald Trump would be our nation's oldest president ever inaugurated, as he had followed up on what he told CBS in August, that he'd very gladly release his medical records to the public, as is, custom. Joining us now, host of the Fast Politics podcast and special correspondent for Vanity Fair, Molly Zhang. Fast. Life comes at you fast, Molly.
Yeah, he made this whole campaign, Donald Trump made the whole campaign about mental fitness, mental acuity, ran against Joe Biden's old age. Well, now Donald Trump is the oldest person ever to run for president, and he's running against a 59-year-old.
There's a little bit of, we don't need a cognitive test. He is out there every day speaking, and you can follow along and make your own judgment. That's not necessarily the point here, right? It is about putting this question of fitness front and center.
Absolutely. It's about drawing contrast. I mean, she's the prosecutor. She has to make the closing argument. And this gives us some added evidence, right? That is to say, look, he won't give us the information around his physical. We know how he talks. He's not giving us the information around his mental acuity. So this is just about giving her more resources, tools to bring the case to the close. But again, for Donald Trump, it doesn't matter. Right. It doesn't matter.
People like the idea of Donald Trump, but they're ignoring the reality of Donald Trump. And this is why Kamala Harris, do you remember when she said at the very first debate, she encouraged people to go to his rallies, to watch him, because she wants people to see how severely diminished he is. Because the idea of this man, this strong man, this successful businessman that they have in their mind, that's not who he is. And she wants everybody to see it.
I would also say it's a case for norms, right? Donald Trump has flouted norms his whole career, right? He hasn't released a physical. He hasn't released his taxes. Right. This is the 3rd time now he's not releasing his taxes. So, do you want normal democracy, or do you want whatever it is that Donald Trump is selling?
Right. I think it also sort of undercuts, though, something that we're seeing in polling and in focus groups, which is as hard as it is for all of us and for our viewers to believe, there are American voters who are simply not that familiar with with Vice President Harris. They're not familiar with her record. They're not familiar with her bio. One of the things you see is the more she's in front of them, the more they learn about her, the more they like her. There's this just sort of fundamental question of, do I trust you? If all of a sudden we find ourselves in a time of crisis, are you the person who I want to be in charge? And she is both answering that question and also saying, your choice is binary. Do you trust this guy in a time of crisis?
You know, and I think that's effective for a certain sector and segment of the electorate. We're talking about reasoned argument, right? I'm reasonable, he's not. I'm trustworthy, he's not. All of that presupposes that reasonableness is informing decision making. One of the things that we have to admit about this current election season is that that's not what's informing it. It's deep passion. Those passions rooted in grievance, rooted in hatred. So every time that we try to disclose or show or illuminate that Donald Trump isn't that guy, it doesn't matter, because that's not the reason why he's attractive to so many Americans.
I think what it more likely does, and you'll tell me if you disagree, is it gets a few voters over a hump, right? Where if they're saying, I'm not sure, I don't know enough about her, for some reason for them it is essentially a wash, that it becomes the final motivating seal the deal to perhaps not turn out for him, but to actually get out there and cast a ballot.
Right, and remember, the MAGA crew is so dug in. You're never going to get those voters, but you don't necessarily need them. You just need that small percentage of voters who are not completely sure. And remember, Trump has a ceiling. Like, there are only a certain amount of people who like what he's selling. And she does not have the same ceiling. And we've seen her favorabilities rise. For example, that debate was huge for her. She did really well, and people really liked her. So I think she's making a gamble here by going on Fox News, that the more of her, the better.
All right, everyone's staying with me. Up next, one of the biggest groups the vice president needs to lock in over these next 3 weeks, Black men. She's got a new plan out today on how to do just that. Stay with us.